Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to These Three Things. And I am so honored to have my dear friend, Tarina Colledge from Fraser Valley Regional District, that's here, British Columbia, Canada, joining us to talk about three things that resonated with her during what was arguably a horrific wildfire season in most parts of Canada, but especially in British Columbia. And we were very fortunate to be able to provide your team a little bit of support, Trina, during what was going on. So today we're going to talk about three things that really resonated for you. I know you've got a lot of experience, and we were chatting earlier. Fascinating how you tie in your background to the film industry, to emergency management. But why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you are, your role, and what's happening in your region, and then we'll get into the events of this past summer.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I'm blessed to be settled in the Fraser Valley in the regional district. I am an electoral area resident, so that puts me in with most of our rural constituents when it comes to the mindset of services. I've been here for a little over 4 years and rebuilding our emergency management program from the ground up. It's been an exciting journey to take us from where we were to where we are today. I do have a background in film, as you mentioned. Did work in film for 10 years. It was sort of my first career before I got into municipal governance. In my film roles, I learned a lot about municipal permitting, different branches and services of municipalities, a lot about public safety. My EM career sort of started as a volunteer in search and rescue, and then a volunteer in emergency support or social services, depending on where you are in the country. And I've been working in local government for 17 years now, with a mixed background in Parks and Rec, public works, engineering, and cemetery administration, as well as film permitting and records management. So it's a really well-rounded background. I transitioned over to EM fully as a career scope in 2015. I moved out of province with my family, settled in Fort McMurray, in an area that didn't really have a lot of big disasters, to add some regional experience on my resume. And we were experiencing a not so small fire not too long after resettling there. So my family lived through evacuating without me while I stayed to do what an emergency manager, EM coordinator, does. In that role, I coordinated the sheltering of 46,000 people across the province, activated the NGO Alliance, and learned a lot about disaster planning and disaster recovery planning and incident situation specific planning, independent of your standard EM plan. So it was a fundamental mindset change from what I had learned in schools. And since then, I have traveled across 4 provinces and 3 states, deployed to Hurricane Harvey in Texas, as well as New Brunswick floods of 2018, Saskatchewan wildfires, and I am also a Team Rubicon Canada volunteer.
See, I just learned a bunch of things that I didn't know. And, through all of that, I was just thinking to myself, one of the things that I've come to appreciate most about you and the interactions that we've had the past while is your passion. You are probably one of the most passionate EM folks that I've met. You're always sending me links, and have you seen this, and what about that, and your drive and connecting all of those dots really makes. I'm surprised we didn't run into each other in Fort Mac in 2016.
We probably did. You were probably buried in the bullpen of the information office. I remember very distinctly being down on level 1 of the REOC, and there was a room that I occasionally would pop my head into to see Jordan, and 30-ish people at any given moment. And again, that's a fundamental lesson to walk away from any event with, because now I realize, and in those moments I learned, that the information officer can be supported by an information office. Mm-hmm. So yeah, conceptually, education taught me that there is one information officer. That is it. That was totally different world.
So this is okay. We got to stay on track for these 3 things, but the information officer is, if you look at ICS Canada or fundamental core ICS, information officer doesn't have to be a communications professional. The information officer is the conduit of information. doesn't have to be the spokesperson, doesn't have to be the person writing the media releases, doesn't have to be, right? That information officer gets the information and passes it to the liaison officer who's maybe making those calls, or to the communications team that's supporting the event. There's lots of different ways to look at it. And I know for myself in the city of Calgary, we're very fortunate. We had this amazing EOC. And when we were activated, I had a seat in the big EOC room, but there was the comms room that was next door to it where we put 18 people to do all of the communications. And so that IO role, yeah, if you're a small group and you know, that's your one position, but it doesn't have to be the person that's public facing. The information officer is accountable for gathering and sharing of information. And that gathering and sharing can be to your comms team. I digress. Okay. So 2023 was pretty wild, and it's wildfire. Lots of fires impacting a lot of Canada and actually across the world this past season. I know in Canada specifically, very hot, dry summer in many parts of Canada. Horrible wildfire season, and you're in the Fraser Valley Regional District, home base Chilliwack, British Columbia. Just spend a few minutes and what was happening in your region that resulted in the activation of your EOC?
Yeah, it was an intriguing series of events, or series of hazards. Let's say hazards. Usually we see freshet on the landscape, freshet being the annual spring melt from the mountains being our first hazard and our big, long hazard. It runs with a very predictable flow. We understand at what point risks are arising from that annual return hazard. This year, wildfire started before we experienced the high snow melt leading to typical freshet flows. And so I believe that I started tracking our first wildfires in March. I still am aiming to connect with someone at Wildfire to see if I can get a fulsome exported report of all of the wildfires that happened in our electoral areas. And for the sake of those watching, an electoral area in a regional district in British Columbia would be similar to what you would consider as a ward in a county elsewhere. We're a very unique governance model, but it's all of our unincorporated non-municipal areas. And so that's the primary focus of our emergency program. I lost count regarding wildfire startup somewhere around 2025, around the end of May, beginning of June, and I just stopped tracking them at that point because there were so many. We had immense drought due to the low snowpack, and if we were to single out the precision of hazards, we would be amiss in considering the relevance of last year's drought and low snowpack. So we still had hazards or wildfires active in our landscape right up through November last year. So the snow season arrival was delayed, and it was a short snow season with the low snowpack. That's great news for freshet, but it's not great news for wildfire and drought. So we actually experienced unprecedented drought in British Columbia this year as a result of the low snowpack and low rain return, which equated to an exorbitant amount of fires on the landscape. Again, many in rural areas of public or crown lands. And the unprecedented events nationwide led to many complexities for response agencies and gaining mutual aid or on-demand aid. So it was just a busy year. And, we recognize that we have sort of a leveling in the beginning of fall, and then we typically turn to a bit of a dense rainfall, which increases landslide risk and likeliness. So we're not through the year yet, and there is no more hazard season in British Columbia. The entire year is a hazard season, and it becomes very challenging to find restful periods to really pick a vacation week and turn yourself off.
I think that's a really important piece. We're so focused, or we tend to be so focused on caring for our communities, caring for our citizens, caring for our, we have to care for ourselves. We have to find that balance which can be really challenging, especially when you're in smaller electoral districts and you don't have a lot of resources to draw on. I remember, during the Calgary floods, some of our smaller communities were like, we need help. And we were sorry, we're busy. We can't give you any help. And, it kind of felt selfish. So I think that one of the important things to consider on that is establishing nurturing relationships well before an event, so that you have some extra resources you can draw on, or at least somebody you can call for some extra support. So let's shift in, Tarina, because it was an experience for you. You've seen a lot, you've done a lot. What three things resonated for you as an emergency management professional from your experiences in the 2023 wildfire season in the Fraser Valley Regional District?
Yeah, the risks are everywhere. Hazards are everywhere. We all live with them. I think as a general society, we need to recognize the risks that we live among and take personal action in preparing for those risks. If you live at the toe of a mountain, you have a landslide risk potentially, or a rock fall risk. Look at the development of our country. Look at the history of how we grew. People live in floodplains because canoes paddled up rivers and found a reasonable shore, and they developed a community. We live with risks. There are tractors and trucks and trailers on our highways carrying toxic chemicals. We have people that have homes along railways. And we have become a society that is so accustomed to expecting that someone else is managing those risks rather than us recognizing that those risks exist and having our own personal action for accountability. I live near a railroad. I live in a single egress road. There's no other way out of my road than the one that goes onto the highway. I need to know how my family will leave my property if that road is not able to be used, or if there is a train derailment at the end of that road. I know that I live in a floodplain, and the dikes that I live within the protection of could fail. I know that I live near a slough and not so far from the base of a mountain. I am surrounded by risks and surrounded by hazards. And I think when we lived before technology, generally speaking, people would look out on their landscape and they would pay attention to what they lived with. And they would have their own knowledge about what they would do if the bad things happened to themselves and their home and their family. Everybody knew that they were on their own and maybe that they would help their neighbors. I think we've come far too far in society where we now expect someone else to take those actions, and we forget about ourselves. And we forget that we are our own first responder, and we have power in being able to keep ourselves safe.
I think that you tie in really nicely the idea of the 72-hour kit, right? Be able to be self-sustainable for at least 72 hours.
14-day kit?
Really.
Yeah.
So I think that's so important, is for everybody to understand. I mean, as a homeowner, remind me never to come stay with you, by the way. I'll just stay at the hotel. There's probably more risk than staying at the hotel.
In a 1952 farmhouse, not current code.
What could go wrong? There's risks everywhere, and we just can't rely on other people, right? Put a helmet on your head when you're riding your bicycle. Follow this. Don't text while you're driving. Those subtle risks that you're taking, we have to be as responsible for them as we can, because we can't always rely on somebody else, especially in a disaster. I used to live outside of the city of Calgary in a acreage community, 4-acre lots. If something were to have happened, they're not sending the cavalry to our little community out that way. We would be on our own. So we actually did a community inventory together. I think we had about 70% opt-in, where do you have elderly living with you? Do you have medical conditions? Who has generators? Who has tractors? Who has chainsaws? Who has whatever? So that together as a community, we could come together. So think about that. Think about how you can, as an individual, as a community, be aware of the risks that are around you all the time. Can't rely on the responders, can't rely on the government in all cases. So take some accountability. Number 2.
Really, it's emphasizing number 1. Number 2 is self-reliance is essential. A disaster, by definition, means that the infrastructure that we typically rely on for societal continuity is impacted. It is beyond capacity. We seem to have key public messaging from high-level officials saying, don't worry, when a bad thing happens, you will receive help. Your government is here to help you. First responders are going to help you. What does that mean when the Canadian Fire Census demonstrates such a vast percentage of our firefighters across Canada aren't trained for landslides? They're not trained for flood response. Why? It's not their core mandate. Primarily, our fire services nationwide are doing medical responses in rural areas as volunteer firefighters. We need to get real with this, because if we understand, based on those facts, that the high percentage of first responders across our nation in our own communities are our neighbors who are volunteers of those fire services, we have to be real and understand they're also impacted by the same disaster that we are impacted by. They don't all live and work in the same neighborhood. Many first responders who are volunteers of FR organizations, volunteer fire departments, they work out of the jurisdiction in the area that they are a volunteer team member of. If there's an impact to a road, they may not be able to get there in a timely manner. Response can be delayed in rural areas, and it's a very different picture in municipalities when you have a guaranteed staffed service and you have a very large pool and a very local boundary. But across the rest of Canada, which is primarily rural, sparsely populated, single egress routes, you are still going to be your own first responder, because you have to know that those first responders are way beyond the capacity. They're struggling to get to where you are. And we have far too much of an expectation on our first responder services to be this superhero for things that they're not resourced for, they're not equipped for, they're not trained for, and we don't fund them well enough. The colloquially, we don't fund them well enough to actually meet all of those extra expectations. At the end of the day, they're still called firefighters in most rural areas. I think it's eye-opening when you tell someone that a firefighter in many rural areas is actually someone who will contain a fire to a fire boundary. We have a vision that we're raised on from childhood that has us believing that firefighters all run into burning buildings to save a life. Every single one of them will, and this is in TV, it's in cartoons, it's in everything that we ever watch. In film, the superheroes do the superhero thing, and they always show up. In rural Canada, there are areas that might have an RCMP officer or 2 or 3 across a few thousand square kilometers. You could be waiting an hour plus for a paramedic. There will be a volunteer search and rescue team that will still take time to get to helping someone. And there might be a volunteer fire service that maybe also has volunteers that work and live in the area. Some fire departments are far more capable based on their population boom. If you look at volunteer fire departments that all are farmers by day, they typically do work in the area and their response time is lickety split. But we have to be real that those first responders are our neighbors. They may be out of area. We may live in areas that don't actually have fire protection, which may mean that our expectation of first responder services is not attuned to the reality that we should be expecting. And we need to know how we will help ourselves and how we will help our neighbors.
Great tie into one thing, way to build on it. You mentioned municipalities that are well staffed, and we're actually seeing post-COVID, a lot of the municipal centers are struggling with recruitment, especially the smaller ones. I know in Alberta, there are some smaller communities that are recruiting hard, and there is such a competition to recruit people to fill the boots. where, they're drawn to the big cities with all of the fancy toys that have all of those resources. It's a whole fascinating formula, actually, when you talk about tax increase, right? Like a tax increase for the city of Calgary, a 1% tax increase in the city of Calgary yields millions of dollars, where a 1% tax increase in a town like Cochrane, might yield $100,000, which might get you a firefighter, so we're in a really challenging spot right now with people are expecting to do remote work these days. Well, guess what? You can't remote work as a firefighter. You need to be where the fire is, right? We're in such an interesting spot right now that, tying back to your one thing about recognizing that there's risks everywhere, taking that responsibility and accountability. Don't rely on. Yeah, it's nice to have, but don't rely on it. And maybe a call to government to look at, where do you really need to be spending some funding right now. I know there's a lot of talk about alternative energy and green, what about the safety of people? I know if you look at Canada Task Force as an example, task force across the country several years ago lost funding. What? It's back now, thanks to the work, I think, of Canada Task Force 2 and Fort McMurray, and a lot of the efforts that were done there. Lots of funding talks with our wildfire fighters, scaling back on some of the resources as we're seeing this increasing trend in wildfires, and then we're scaling back resourcing on that. And, then we find ourselves looking to other places in the world like Africa. Please send us firefighters because we don't have enough here. I don't know what the bill is for that, but I imagine the reactive bill is a lot more than the proactive bill. So that's great insight, Tarina. Third thing.
Spontaneous collaboration will occur. Being an instructor of the incident command system, wholly believing that we all ought to know the ICS structure and use principle-based approaches to managing emergencies, I recognize the desire to have command and control in many areas that I have deployed. I think when we realize and reflect upon the definition of disaster, again, building off of number 2, means that our infrastructure of society is not able to manage, is beyond its capacity to be in command and control of this incident. They'll do everything that they possibly can. Every first responder will make decisions based on the risks that they see. But there will never, when we're in big disasters, be enough resources to manage every single incident happening in our landscape. Disaster research globally has demonstrated through history of disaster research that spontaneous collaboration occurs. And it's time that we start looking at systems, the systems that we know, that we use, that we love, that we leverage, and think about spontaneous collaboration and how we integrate ad hoc models of spontaneous collaboration under the direction and control of a strike team lead or an incident commander, however that makes sense, so that we can see resiliency groups occur on the landscape. In our own rural jurisdiction, we know the concept of neighbors helping neighbors is going to be real. It has been real in every event we've had. We don't need to stop neighbors from helping neighbors. And to be very realistic, I don't need to control the volunteer list when there are other bodies out there that already have pre-affiliated volunteers. We have ratepayers groups across the country that represent local rural ratepayers. We've got different organizations and municipalities that have their own volunteer groups. We spend a lot of time trying to train and practice with these pre-affiliated emergency management volunteers or ESS volunteers. But the reality is we don't need to own and control everything. We need to have systemic capacity to integrate things that already exist into the framework of ICS. ICS has the flexibility. It has the space to do so. And so if we can relinquish a little bit of our desire to have command and control of all things, and that only our pre-trained, pre-affiliated, screened first responders are the ones in the door, and instead look at these ad hoc approaches that occur across the landscape, we'll never be able to stop them all from occurring. So let's actually leverage that. Instead of recognizing that as a threat, let's turn that into a tool. A neighborhood group, a ratepayers association, or a community association has its members. They know each other. They already have a trust relationship within their community. And when they look to one another, it doesn't take a lot of effort for a community group to pick one person that is that person that's going to identify the critical risks on the landscape, tell someone of the official response, hey, we have 3 people that need critical heart medicine. You stay focused on the disaster life safety things. We'll take care of all of the other things that you can't handle right now. And we'll do so under your direction, under your authority. If we have the triggers and the processes clarified in our planning processes, we can empower these models to be realistically effective, safely effective, and to work in disasters so that first responders can do the very primary thing that they need to do, which is whatever it is that they feel they need to do in that moment, whether it's life safety or incident stabilization. Because I don't need to tell a first responder from an EOC what they have to do. They're going to make the decisions based on what they see. They're doing their tactical size up at an incident scene. If you have a neighborhood group that says, hey, give us the evacuation order template, we can go do the door knocking and tell everybody to get out. And what trigger point do we need to leave? And who do we report back to? You've now amplified the force of a volunteer fire service, or an area that doesn't have a first responder service could still do this and report by telephone or email or text or whatever communication stream you have through and to an emergency operations center or emergency coordination center. And we can still have a process that keeps this activity occurring organically, but safely and in partnership at the grassroots level, in partnership with the official response and official responders.
You talk about relinquishing command and control, and I think the other one is letting go of the fear of liability. There's that fear of, well, if we let the volunteers in, what if somebody gets hurt? What if, right? Letting go of that. And I think what you're speaking about, one of the best examples that comes to mind for me is the Cajun Navy down in Houston.
For sure.
I think it was Katrina, when Katrina came in and people were standing on their roofs. They couldn't get through to 911. They took to Facebook and stuff, and the authorities said, sorry, we can't take calls for help or calls for service by social media. You got to call 911. And they're like, we're trying to, but we can't get through. And then all of a sudden the Cajun Navy was replying to those Facebook posts saying, where are you? We're on our way. So you have this mass group of volunteers doing rescues to people that needed rescuing that at that time the responding groups weren't able to get to because of the 911 system failure.
Yeah, that's a great example. Cajun Navy also experienced risks and hazards, and there are stories of electrocution with live wires in water. Whether they were Cajun Navy volunteers or not, I don't know. They're people who were operating in a little aluminum boat. But if you think about an ad hoc approach like that, self-action, spontaneous collaboration, it did occur, it will continue to occur. And if we think about how we add connectivity, if the Cajun Navy had one point of contact, and that point of contact was linked to the EOC, ECC, first responder, incident commander, a communication link, like, here's the hazards that you're going to experience, here's what we need you to focus on because we can't do the thing and we're doing this thing. We now start seeing force multiplication happening as a result of collaboration. And occasionally in the first responder world, I'll share a disaster research paper that I really love to talk about. And I never can remember who wrote it, where it came from, but it's called The 4 C's of Disaster Partnering. And the 4 C's of disaster partnering are collaboration, communication, cooperation, and coordination. Command and control are not either of the C's. But there's a lot of space within the incident command system to look at those 4 C's and realize that we build the ICS structure with those 4 at the core of every function.
That's such great insights, Trina. Spontaneous collaboration ties in a lot to do with conformity, and I think that's underpinned with our own innate desire to help. A lot of people find it really. I think there was a story out of the 2023 wildfire seasons about a woman. I forget what area she was, not too far from you, who wanted to go provide food to people that were fighting the fires, and she was ordered to return home and not to leave her property. And all she wanted to do, maybe I don't know, maybe it wasn't safe for her to be out on the roads, but it's really hard for people to walk down. So instead of an authoritative approach, try to find the balance. Try to find the balance between keeping people safe, not adding to the problem. You don't want those volunteers to now be needing rescued and all that kind of stuff. I'll never forget in the 2013 floods in Calgary, such an outcry of volunteers saying, we need to help, we need to help, we need to help. And so at one point, the city said, okay, we got to do something to get these volunteers engaged. And I think we put out a call for 500. And like 6,000 showed up in masses. It's going to happen regardless, right? The Facebook groups are going to start to appear. They're going to start to be doing that. So to your point, Trina, leverage it, embrace it, provide some direction, and keep people safe, and together work towards a great outcome.
Yeah, build a framework for it. It just makes so much sense.
There you go. If you want a framework for spontaneous collaboration, Tarina Colledge, Fraser Valley Regional District is your gal. Summarize those 3 things for us, Tarina. Repeat them. 3s.
Hazards and risks are everywhere. Self-reliance is essential. Spontaneous collaboration will occur.
There you go. 3 things that resonate for Tarina Colledge post 2023 wildfire season. And
the Canadian Fire Census report. Just read it.
There you go. Thanks for the chat today, Tarina. You're awesome. And hey, we're going to see you soon. We're popping out to Chilliwack to do a workshop with your group, and super looking forward to that. And beers on me.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you.